as well, or
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. There has been consultation with the other parties, and if you seek it, I believe that you are going to find unanimous consent for the following motion. That in the opinion of the House, that the government must recognize what happened in Canada's Indian residential schools as genocide as acknowledged by Pope Francis and in accordance with Article 2 of the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
All those opposed to the honourable member moving the motion will please say nay. Agreed. The House has heard the terms of the motion. All those opposed to the motion will please say nay. Carried.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the breakdown for October 30th, 2022. My name is Nate Pike. I'm your host for the evening, and we wanted to start tonight out with that clip because, simply put, it's some progress. So for some context on that clip was of, at the federal level, NDP MP Leah Gazin her motion calling on the government to recognize what has happened in Canada's Indian residential schools as genocide. And it was passed by unanimous consent in the House of Commons. Now, we got some things we got to talk about tonight on the show, so we wanted to start with something that was, like we said, showing a little bit of progress, because there's some people who really need to hear that. And one of those people happens to be right close, literally, to the Premier of Alberta. That person is Max de Groot, and I'm trying to pronounce his name right. I hope I am, not 100% certain I am or not. And the reason why we felt maybe Max needed to hear that is because it seems like there's this proud tradition for Alberta premiers where they get into office and then immediately it becomes clear that a lot of the people that they keep very close to them are in fact people who hold some really problematic, some might say racist views about Canada and Canada's history. And the reason why we're bringing this up is because Max de Groot wrote a screed, maybe we could call it, a few years back, all the way back in 2019, so really not that long ago. And one of the things that Mr. de Groot wrote in that column was that every Human Rights or Truth and Reconciliation Commission or parliamentary apology represents an effort by government to bring the victim mindset to a wider world. So already we see that Danielle Smith is involving people in her by-election campaign who hold really hateful, really problematic views in regards to truth and reconciliation, which is why that clip and why that progress that we saw means so much and why it's so important. And then we got a couple of other light stuff that we want to work our way through. And the next one has to do with a tweet that was sent out after the UCP AGM by somebody who's continuing his longstanding tradition of just not being all that funny and being largely irrelevant. We're talking about comedian Rob Schneider. He tweeted out his support for Danielle Smith, saying Alberta has a real leader. Rob Schneider has been a very, very, very anti-vax, anti-health response person throughout the whole pandemic. And that's really all that we're going to say about it, because as much as he's always been irrelevant, he's still irrelevant. One of the reasons why we wanted to start with some lighthearted stuff to begin with has to do with the fact that there's a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about tonight is it's not funny, haha. It's sort of funny in the way that if you imagine like a Mickey Mouse shaped meteor hurtling towards the Earth, and it's the size of the Empire State Building, you know, it's funny that it's shaped like Mickey Mouse, but it's still not very good, is it? And that's really what we're going to be talking about tonight, because the new premier, had a very busy week. She swore in her new cabinet, and they all look very thrilled to have been sworn in. And there's some things to note about that new cabinet. Perhaps the biggest one is that there are, looking at that picture, you can count, there's 4 women plus Danielle Smith. There's more anti-vax, anti-science ministers than there are women. And this is what Danielle Smith had to say about the representation of women in her cabinet.
As for status of women, I'm a woman. I've got 4 senior cabinet ministers who are women. If people think that there's any danger that women are not going to be represented, then I would ask that they just look at the composition that we have.
So Smith's saying, look at the composition that we have, but at the same time as she's saying that, the composition is 4 women and a premier in a cabinet of 27 people. There are other women who were elected to the UCP, and there are there is some bench strength to pull from, but for whatever reason, Danielle Smith decided that she only wanted 4 women. Now, at the same press conference, he also made some pretty problematic comments in regards to the WEF. So there had been a lot of controversy in the run-up to the cabinet announcement in regards to the WEF, because Danielle Smith had said that she'd heard that there was an agreement between Alberta Health Services and the WEF, and that was totally unacceptable. It was not good at all. Danielle Smith would have nothing to do with it. She was going to put an end to that agreement. And she was asked about it again at the press conference after she announced her cabinet. Here's what she had to say.
I guess I find it distasteful when billionaires brag about how much control they have over political leaders, as the head of that organization has. And I think that is offensive. The people who should be directing government are the people who vote for them. And the people who vote for me and for my colleagues are people who live in Alberta and who are affected by our decisions. And so, quite frankly, until that organization stops bragging about how much control they have over political leaders, I have no interest in being involved with them. My focus is here in Alberta, solving problems for Albertans with the mandate from Albertans.
Now, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, first of all, one thing that we're going to ask you to save for later is the comment about billionaires shouldn't be dictating, people with money shouldn't be dictating what government does, because that gets really relevant really, really quick. But ultimately, she's taking something out of context. We tried to look to find, as the problem with Danielle Smith is that she never provides any sort of citations. She says things, and then she just sort of lets it hang. She never backs those things up with any sort of facts or records or anything like that. It's unfortunate, but it's the reality of what she does. And so there's no point that we can go to where we can say, oh yeah, this is where that WEF official said that thing and that's what it's about. The closest that we could find was an internet clip that circulated a while back where a WEF official was talking about how great it was that they were getting more of their people into government positions. But when they were talking about their people, what they were specifically talking about was young people. It wasn't WEF officials. It wasn't people aligned with the WEF. It was just people who were young. They're advocating for a younger representation in politics, which by most measures isn't actually a bad thing. But all of that aside, it's worth talking about what the program was that Danielle Smith wants to cut. So we know so far it's an Alberta Health Services program. We know that they were working with the WEF in some capacity. What was the actual program? There's been a lot of speculation. There's been a lot of people who like to maybe invent some things, but we figured we would go right to the source. So we went right to the Alberta Health Services announcement page from 2020, where they talked about what the program was. And we were able to pull together a few video clips where Dr. Richard Lewinchuk, I hope I'm saying that right, who's the Senior Medical Director for Health System Integration, made these comments about the announcement of the program.
The Global Coalition for Value in Healthcare is a group of the World Economic Forum that looks at what healthcare in the future should or could look like. Value-based healthcare really refers to getting the best outcomes for a given cost. Historically, we've paid a lot of attention to the cost side, and we talk about reducing costs, and we haven't really looked at what people want from a healthcare system. Value-based healthcare and getting the best value for the money spent turns the equation around and helps us to focus on what's important to people, and then looks at how much we're willing to pay in order to achieve those outcomes. It gives us the ability to interact with other world leaders in healthcare, to share ideas, to share experiences, to learn from them, to attract bright minds to Alberta, people that really want to be at the forefront of healthcare systems and healthcare delivery.
So let's be clear. What we were talking about when it came to that AHS program was simply a program that was going to increase the quality of healthcare that people were getting, rather than simply focusing on the dollar value, trying to make sure that those dollars were best spent in order to make sure that people were getting the health outcomes that they really wanted, that they really valued. Not only that, but it was a program that apparently was going to bring some of the best and brightest minds in medicine from around the world to Alberta. It was an information sharing program between Harvard and the Mayo Clinic, which are two of the most respected medical institutions in the world. This is the evil program that Danielle Smith wanted to shut down. But there were some other things that came out of the cabinet announcements as well. One of the most surprising ones was the stuff that she forgot to include. So one of the guiding principles of how cabinets are formed is a premier takes a look at all of the different responsibilities that exist within government, and the premier then says, okay, given all of these responsibilities, this is how I'm going to organize them. And they get organized into ministries. Well, Danielle Smith was so busy handing out cabinet spots, because again, it's worth remembering that this cabinet is one of the biggest cabinets in recent history. It's certainly the biggest first cabinet for the last 5 or 6 governments. That's how big it is. Well, she was so busy handing out all of those roles that she forgot to include some responsibilities. The two key responsibilities that were left out, before we get to that, she eliminated the labor ministry. So there's no labor ministry in the Alberta government anymore. And that's probably why these two things fell through the cracks. But the two things that fell through the cracks were there was nobody who was assigned responsibility for the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and there was nobody who was assigned responsibility for the Labor Relations Code. These are two incredibly important responsibilities. And after it was pointed out, Danielle Smith scrambled to make sure that those roles and those responsibilities were being filled. But there's some other pieces about the cabinet that are particularly interesting. One of them is that Leela Aheer is the only person who ran in the UCP leadership race who didn't get a cabinet posting. Now, the relationship between Leela Aheer and Danielle Smith was, to call it acrimonious is probably a little bit of an understatement, because Danielle Smith did, at a function in Fort McMurray, go after Leela Aheer quite aggressively when Leela Aheer was calling out her Sovereignty Act. And she said, you know what? You're not even going to get your nomination. You're not going to get reelected. You don't matter. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that was the essence of what Danielle Smith said to Leela Aheer. So maybe it's not a surprise to many people that Leela Aheer didn't get a cabinet post, but she was the only UCP leadership candidate who didn't get a cabinet post in the largest cabinet in recent history and memory. Well, Leela Aheer made her own announcement this week, where she announced that she was not going to be seeking any nomination. She wasn't going to be running for the UCP at all in the next provincial election, whenever that may be. Now, one of the other things that happened this week was the legislature, the legislative session, was prorogued. Now, there's a lot of people who have said, well, I don't really understand what proroguing means. And what it basically boils down to is, if you think of like your favorite television season or your favorite television series, and you expect that there's going to be 24 episodes in that season. Well, all of a sudden, the cable network or whoever's producing that show announces, you know what? We're going to cut it 6 episodes short. Now, there's a lot of unfinished business. There's a lot of unfinished plot lines that happen. And then maybe the show gets renewed, maybe it doesn't. In this case, the show's definitely getting renewed. But it's a helpful metaphor as to how to think about it, because basically what proroguing the legislative session means is that it's the end of the legislative session. So any bills that we're in the process of getting looked at, they're not going to get passed. That's it for them. They can be reintroduced, but they're toast. The other thing that it means is that at the start of the next legislative session, which has been announced as being November 29th, there will be a new throne speech. It's basically a reboot or a retcon of the last season in order to create the new season being whatever the new premier, in this case Danielle Smith, wants. But perhaps most importantly, what it means is that there's no opportunity for the official opposition to launch any questions about why it is that the government's doing what it is when it's doing it. Now, Danielle Smith has made some pretty bold strokes in regards to what she's going to have the government do over the next little bit, and she's been very clear they're going to make a lot more in the way of bold moves. So creating an environment where the official opposition, and by extension of that, Albertans, aren't going to have any opportunity to hold the government to account until November 29th is very, very convenient for Danielle Smith and the UCP, but it's extremely problematic for Albertans. Now, one of the other things that came out this week, moving on from there, has to do with the fact that Tyler Shandro's hearings with the Law Society have been rescheduled. Some of you who have been following Alberta politics for a while might remember that a while back, Tyler Shandro, who was then Minister of Health, got himself in a whole lot of trouble. Not only did he show up in a physician's driveway and scream at them over a Facebook meme, but he also potentially crossed some privacy lines when he got a hold of a physician's phone number that he shouldn't have been able to get a hold of and called him after effectively a town hall at night on his personal line. Now, all of this adds up to some questions about whether or not Tyler Shandro has been behaving like lawyers are supposed to behave. There was a hearing that was scheduled. It got delayed, and it's now been rescheduled for January 24th to 26th. But in the meantime, Tyler Shandro has moved from the health ministry through another ministry and is now the Minister of Justice for the province of Alberta, which means the Chief Solicitor and the Minister of Justice for the province of Alberta is the same guy who has hearings pending in regards to whether or not he met the minimum standard of conduct for a lawyer, let alone a minister of the Crown. Moving on from there, one of the things that Danielle Smith has talked about is the fact that she wants to completely revamp AHS. She wants to get rid of the board. What she's described in some venues sounds very much like what happened to her when she was a CBE, Calgary Board of Education trustee, and she created an environment allegedly that was so toxic that the government of the time said, you know what, you're all going to go into timeout and we're going to appoint somebody to run the board until we can have another election because this is out of control. Well, it sounds like Danielle Smith wants to do the exact same thing to the AHS board. We talked last week about the fact that there was an AHS board member who actually resigned the night that Danielle Smith was elected to be the new leader of the UCP, and by extension of that, the Premier of Alberta, because she was so concerned at the direction that Danielle Smith would take AHS and the province. Well, there's a lot more people who are adding their voices to those concerns. So a group of union leaders got together this week and they held a press conference where they raised concerns about the fact that healthcare is still very much in a crisis. The reality is we see an unending onslaught of stories about ambulance shortages or about extremely long wait times in hospitals, especially children's hospitals. We see more and more stories in the news about healthcare practitioners who are burning out and are experiencing stress-related injury because of how hard they've been working with very little support during the entire pandemic and for many years in the run-up before that. And these union leaders are saying, with all of this going on, now is not the best time to start making major changes to the healthcare system. And the rumors that are circulating around the types of major changes that Danielle Smith wants to make are pretty big. Already there's conversations going on that she's going to make major changes with EMS or paramedics. There's been stories circulating about Danielle Smith is going to quickly and immediately move the dispatch centers back to the municipalities and use that as a bridge potentially to say to the municipalities, oh, and by the way, you get the ambulance services too, which for some municipalities the major municipalities is a good thing and something that they've been fighting for. But for some of the smaller ones, they might not have the resources to put forward the same kind of ambulance service that they've been able to enjoy with AHS. And the speculation is that that's going to lead to an opportunity where the government is going to say, well, look, municipalities, if you can't provide the level of service, then what we're going to do is we're going to take the money that we were going to give to you and we're going to contract out to private companies. It's worth noting that there are already private companies that provide ambulance services in Alberta. So it's not a big leap, but it raises some very big questions about private delivery of healthcare in the province. Moving on from there, one of the other more bizarre things that Danielle Smith raised this week had to do with a new arena for Calgary. So for those of you that aren't from Calgary or haven't been paying attention to municipal politics all that much, this has been a rather contentious issue. In the run-up to the last set of municipal elections, there was actually an arena deal in place. Shortly after the municipal elections, that arena deal, for a whole list of reasons, fell through. Now, it's worth noting that when we're talking about arena deals, what we tend to be talking about is the fact that sports teams that make boatloads of money, entertainment groups that make boatloads of money, are able to leverage what they do in their communities to get public dollars to pay for their private arenas. And it sounds like Danielle Smith is pushing for that same thing again. And that caused a lot of people to ask, well, why would she do that? Well, there's a whole list of potential reasons, but at the top of it, has to be questions in regards to her previous role. Right before this election, she was the president of the Alberta Enterprise Group. The Alberta Enterprise Group is a pro-business development organization in Alberta, and she was effectively a lobbyist for that group as the president. Now, where things start to get particularly interesting is one of the keystone members of the group, and has been for quite a long time, happens to be one of the owners of the Calgary Flames. So N. Murray Edwards is an owner of the Calgary Flames. He's been involved with the Alberta Enterprise Group for, as per his words on their website, since the start. Now, all of a sudden, Danielle Smith is the Premier of Alberta. She's no longer the president of the Alberta Enterprise Group, and she's advocating for a new arena for the guy who's a keystone member of the organization that she used to be the president of. But it gets even stranger, because up until 2015, Anne Marie Edwards had donated tens of thousands of dollars to both the PCs and the Wild Rose, particularly when Danielle Smith was running the Wild Rose. Now, his biggest donations came in 2015, and then they suddenly stopped. And the reason why they suddenly stopped is Anne Marie Edwards, despite being a co-owner of the Calgary Flames, left Alberta. There were increases to income taxes in Alberta at the federal and the provincial level in 2015. And before those kicked in, Anne Marie Edwards decided to get out of Alberta. He still remained a member of the Alberta Enterprise Group. He still remained a co-owner of the Calgary Flames. And now, the past president of that organization is saying that despite the fact that she's in the middle of a by-election, she's going to be advocating, working very, very hard to make sure that the Flames get the arena that they deserve. Which brings us to the other very strange thing that Danielle Smith did. There's lots of very strange things that Danielle Smith did in the last week. That's why the show's taking so long. But one of the other very strange things that she did at the municipal level is she announced that she was looking at allowing for the creation of political parties at the municipal level. Now, this is a fairly contentious issue because municipal politicians aren't members of organized parties at the municipal level. Lots of them are members of provincial parties, lots of them are members of federal parties, but there's no party system at the municipal level. And the idea behind that is that allows municipal councillors and mayors to make independent decisions that are in the best interests of the constituents and the towns and the cities that they're supposed to represent. Introducing political parties could potentially upset that. But nonetheless, Danielle Smith said, you know what? No, I'm seriously looking at it. And the reason why was because she said she'd heard from a Calgary City Councillor who had thought that it was a really good idea. That city councillor is a gentleman named Dan McLean. Now, Dan McLean obviously has some good reasons to want to promote the idea of political parties at the municipal level, because in the last municipal election in Calgary, he was effectively part of the closest thing that could be. Dan McLean ran as part of a slate called Take Back City Hall. There was a group of candidates all across the city of Calgary who were part of this slate, not a political party, who ran for office. Dan McLean was the only one who got elected. But this story that broke that Dan McLean was the person who was talking to Danielle Smith and saying, hey, you know what, we really, really should look at bringing in political parties at the municipal level, touched off some other things. Because people pointed out that Dan McLean was a member of Take Back City Hall. They also pointed out some anonymous videos that went up on the internet. And these anonymous videos reportedly, allegedly, I'm going to hedge my language very carefully here for obvious reasons. These videos seem to show Dan McLean and two other individuals engaging in some very, very racist behavior where they're imitating First Nations accents, apparently, and they're making fun of First Nations names, and they're engaging in some really gross behavior. Now, Dan McLean has since come out and said, oh, I don't remember any of that, but, you know, sometimes people make mistakes. But he hasn't explicitly apologized for it. But a couple of days ago, what he did do is he posted a video and a statement to Facebook. Now, we're not going to play the whole video for you because it's a lot to sit through. But what's most telling, perhaps, is what comes at the end of the video.
I too hope for a brighter future where politicians, political operatives, the media, the Twitterati maybe quit using religion and culture to divide us. Now more than ever, we need to work together towards our path towards reconciliation, a brighter future, and prosperity for all of us. Thank you.
Now, there's a few things that are worth pointing out there. The first has to be that nowhere in the video did Dan McLean actually apologize for what appears in the video. The very racist bad one, to be clear. Nowhere in the video did he apologize, take ownership, anything like that. And there's a lot of people who are really upset and really offended by that. But one of the other concerns that people have said is that he seems to be displacing a lot of the blame. People weren't upset because of religion. People weren't upset because culture. People were upset because there was a video of somebody, a couple of somebodies, engaging in what appears to be extraordinarily racist behavior, on engaging in extraordinarily racist stereotypes. And it's people just believe that it's beneath what they expect from elected officials. It has nothing to do with divisive culture or divisive religion. We couldn't find anywhere that there was any mention of any religion involved in the whole thing. Moving on from there. One of the fascinating things that has also come out of the last week has been the fact that Danielle Smith seems to be governing by memo to her ministers that also double as press releases. She released 2 in the last week that were a little bit on the strange side. One of them had to do with the campaign piece that she's talked about, which has to do with economic corridors. She seems to believe that despite the fact that the federal government oversees national projects, or projects that cross provinces. That's the federal government's jurisdiction. She seems to believe that she's got some sort of crafty way that she can navigate around that by building these economic corridors with other provinces. One of the key projects that she wants to do is build a pipeline and a rail line to the Port of Churchill. Now, on its face, if you ignore certain facts, It doesn't seem like a bad idea. It's a fairly straight line. But the problem is that the terrain that's involved freezes and thaws on a regular basis and is famous for swallowing up infrastructure. It's extraordinarily hard to build roads there that stay stable, let alone major pieces of infrastructure like pipelines or railways. The other problem with the Port of Churchill is that the area of water simply isn't deep enough to run in the kind of ships that would be needed to ship out significant levels of oil and gas. So it's a project that a lot of people tend to get started on, but then once you take a look at the engineering and the requirements, all of the experts in the field say, well, that's never going to work. But this is one of the things that Danielle Smith wants to push. The other one that she put out this week, which was very strange, was the one where she talked about how if the federal government tried to put any strings attached to any money that they were giving Alberta, then she was basically telling her ministers, you know what, we're not going to take that money. We're going to reject it. Now, the program that should immediately come to mind is a program like the inexpensive childcare that makes childcare accessible for people who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford it so that they can go work, they can contribute to the economy. There's lots of programs like that. And there's certain things that the federal government is absolutely responsible for funding. But there's a lot of programs, stuff like their contributions to the the orphan wells cleanup, that isn't part of the regular budget. These are extra things. Another great example would be the buying of TMX. And when we're talking about these sort of extra expenditures that the federal government puts into provinces, it's better to think of them as investments. And when you start to think of them as investments, you realize that any investor who's investing major amounts of money often wants to have just a little bit of say in how that money's spent, so they know where the money's going to go, and they know they're going to get value for their money. In the case of something like TMX, maybe in a little bit of a return on investment. It's not an unreasonable thing to ask for. But in the letter that Danielle Smith sent to her ministers, which reads more like a press release because she makes statements about how the federal government doesn't negotiate in good faith, it flies in the face of the things that she's criticized the federal government for. Because she's already poisoning the well of any negotiations or any conversations by making the statements that she's making here. And she's willing to put the quality of life of Albertans on the line so that she can have complete or as much control over her little fiefdom of Alberta as she possibly wants. Which brings us to her campaign in Cyprus Medicine Hat. Sorry, that's Brooks Medicine Hat. That joke works because, as you can see on the screen here, multiple sources, including an editor for the Medicine Hat News, reported that Smith had door-knocked in the wrong constituency at the start of her campaign by-election in Brooks Medicine Hat. Instead of door-knocking in Brooks Medicine Hat, she was door-knocking in Cyprus Medicine Hat. Now, not only has this editor for the Medicine Hat News said that what they've done is they've reached out to Danielle Smith's campaign. They were told that they were going to get a statement and an answer. And Danielle Smith has said, her campaign has said nothing, which is probably pretty telling. But Danielle Smith also started her by-election campaign off in an extremely rocky way, because one of the things that she did was she attended a grand opening event for the Medicine Hat College's new co-op wellness commons with ministers Copping and Nicolaides. Now, this is a big problem because ministers Copping and Nicolaides were invited there because the provincial government provided funding for that co-op wellness commons to be a thing. It was a government project in part. Now, there's very strict rules that exist in regards to how people can campaign in by-elections, because the idea is it should be a level playing field. People shouldn't be able to use the resources of the government to campaign to increase their chances of winning their seat in a by-election. But that's pretty much exactly what Danielle Smith did. But this was just the start Because Danielle Smith's campaign manager also sent out an invitation for a municipal roundtable discussion with Premier Danielle Smith. And that invitation went out to elected officials all across the area that Danielle Smith is running to represent. Now, this is a big problem for a whole bunch of reasons. But the biggest problem is, imagine being one of those elected officials and getting that invitation. You have the opportunity to sit down with what appears to be a private meeting with the Premier of Alberta, where you can represent your constituents and you can bring forward your concerns. But it is also a huge ethical violation. Not necessarily a violation of the rules, that'll be ruled on, but it creates a moral dilemma. Because on the other hand, if you're an elected official who doesn't want to be part of the Danielle Smith by-election campaign, you don't want to give it legitimacy in the area that you live in, the area that you represent, the question that you're forced to ask yourself is, if I don't go to this event, if I don't go to this exclusive roundtable event with the Premier of Alberta, am I burning bridges down the road? As we talked about earlier, Danielle Smith made it very, very clear with Leela here, she can hold a grudge. And so imagine being an elected official in any of those areas and having to ask yourself, if I don't go to this thing, is Danielle Smith going to be pissed off at me? And when I try to get infrastructure for the area that I'm supposed to represent, is that going to cause me problems? It's a really irresponsible move by not only Danielle Smith's campaign manager, but it's a really irresponsible move by Danielle Smith. But it actually gets worse. Because one of the things that we started to wonder about is, who is Danielle Smith's campaign manager? Who would do this sort of thing? Well, as you start to work your way down the rabbit hole, you discover Danielle Smith's campaign manager is a woman named Alexandra Carlisle. Now, Alexandra has a lot of experience. For example, she's listed on the website for the Alberta Council. What's the Alberta Council? Well, the Alberta Council is a professional group that does a lot of lobbying. And Danielle Smith's campaign manager, Alexandra Carlisle, is in fact a lobbyist working for the Alberta Council. For anybody who's not familiar with what a lobbyist is, basically it's somebody that organizations can pay to get access to elected officials to advance the causes of their concerns, which is kind of problematic because it turns into a bit of a pay-for-play thing. If you pay the right lobbyist the right amount of money, you're going to get better access to the politicians. We took a look, and there are 45 files that Alexandra Carlisle is currently lobbying the provincial government on. But where it gets really crazy, and where it turns into a whole lot of questions, is the fact that Alexandra Carlisle is currently representing 40 different groups on 40 different open files that are directly lobbying the Premier's office. So the Premier's campaign manager and chief strategist is also somebody who's lobbying the Premier's office on behalf of 40 different organizations. Now, one of the other things that people noticed is Danielle Smith has been doing a lot of talking about the fact that, there's all of these other healthcare workers out there who should be able to practice to their full scope. One of the groups that is arguing that they'd like to be able to practice not only to their full scope, but more independently are nurse practitioners. Now, I want to be really clear. We're not denigrating nurse practitioners at all. Nurse practitioners play an extraordinarily important role in the healthcare system. Historically, though, nurse practitioners work collaboratively as part of a team with physicians. They don't practice independently. They don't open their own clinics. But it's something that nurse practitioners are wanting to do. Now, that turns into a really complex issue, and we're not going to debate that tonight. But Danielle Smith has been talking about the fact that maybe we should be letting nurse practitioners open some clinics. Maybe that would solve our healthcare problems. You probably already know where this is going. One of the lobbyists that's representing nurse practitioners is the Premier of Alberta's campaign manager. This sets an extraordinarily dangerous precedent because it then becomes a question of if you pay the right company who has the right employees, seems to be working out pretty good for the nurse practitioners so far. They got some good media this week. But they're also being represented by the Premier of Alberta's campaign manager. But that's still just the beginning. Because Alexandra Carlisle has a bit of a past before that. She's actually quite a conservative operative and goes back quite a few years. One of the biggest stories that we could find that she was involved in had to do with a situation where a Liberal MP was recorded at an event. So Alexandra Carlisle went to the event. She had a secret recorder that she brought with her, which is legal because in Canada, if one person who's involved in the conversation knows that they're being recorded, that's totally okay. And while she was there, she managed to get a recording of some pretty problematic comments that were made. Now that recording made its way back to the federal Conservatives, and they made a whole bunch of hay out of it, including Jason Kenney, as when he was an MP at the time. But it kind of blew up on them. Because it turns out that despite the fact that it was presented as the Liberal candidate was the one who made those comments, a Conservative supporter later stepped out on Facebook and said, no. It wasn't him that said it. It was me. I've never voted Liberal. I've been a Conservative supporter. But I don't think somebody should get roasted for something that they didn't say. Now, we tried to find some record of Alexandra Carlisle saying, oh, whoa, guys. No, it wasn't that guy. It was the other guy. Maybe don't make a big deal out of that. But we couldn't find any record of that. It goes even farther, though, because if you look under Alexandra Carlisle's maiden name, which is Constantinidis. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. I'll apologize directly to Ms. Carlisle. I apologize for getting your maiden name wrong. I'm not great at pronunciation. But when she was Alexandra Constantinidis was when this scandal happened. And it was also her dad that ran for the Wild Rose in the 2012 election. So her connections to Danielle Smith go way back. Got a couple other stories that we want to talk about this week. One of the biggest ones has to be the ruling that came down on a court case that's been going on for quite a few months now in regards to masking in schools. So this court case was a result of a group of parents who have immunocompromised kids. And when Adriana LaGrange issued her edict that there would be no masks, no school boards were allowed to mandate masks. Doesn't matter if there's an outbreak, doesn't matter what the evidence is, there's no masks allowed in schools anymore. And at the same time, the Chief Medical Officer of Health removed the requirement for schools to have masks. And for these immunocompromised kids, their parents and the Alberta Federation of Labor and two lawyers who worked the case pro bono said, this may be putting these kids at risk. We should maybe do something about this. Well, the ruling came down this week. And it's a pretty big deal. So, like we said, basically the whole premise of the court case was that the order rescinded, the Chief Medical Officers of Health rescinded the order requiring masks. And that Adriana LaGrange made a very public statement that schools were not allowed to have masks anymore. Well, what the judge determined is that based on the evidence that was presented in that court case, the decision wasn't made by Dina Henshaw, the Chief Minister of Health. It wasn't made based on science. It wasn't made based on evidence. It was implemented because of a decision that Cabinet made, that Jason Kenney's Cabinet made. The decision to remove masks in schools was not made by a medical professional. It wasn't made by the person in charge of protecting Albertans during the pandemic. It was made by politicians who were getting a lot of heat at that time for having health measures in place. The other thing that the judge found was that despite the fact that Adriana LaGrange presented her edict of there shall not be any more mask mandates in schools, she had no authority to do that. She doesn't have the ability to issue sweeping edicts like that. She could have proposed some regulation. She could have made some changes to legislation inside of the legislature, but that's not what she did. She wrote a letter, and the judge determined that letter simply wasn't good enough. She didn't have the power to do that. Now, one of the other things that the judge did in the course of this ruling was he made it very, very clear and put to rest a debate that's been going on since the CMOH started issuing health protections. There's been a lot of people who've been very confused as to who gets to make the decisions when and how. We saw Jason Kenney saying that he was making a lot of decisions. We saw Tyler Shandro saying when he was Minister of Health that he was making some decisions. But the reality is, during the type of situation that Alberta was in, the Chief Medical Officer of Health, that's Dr. Deena Henshaw, has the authority to say, this is what the evidence is, this is what the science is, and this is what we're doing. She doesn't need permission from Cabinet. The judge felt it was so important to clarify that he issued a statement in the course of his ruling. This is really, really important because it was that confusion that a lot of people feel was used to take advantage of the situation. Now, of course, as soon as that was issued, Danielle Smith had a great big temper tantrum. She issued a statement of her own saying that the government will prevent any mask mandates in the future because masks hurt kids. They don't. There's no evidence to say that masks have any sort of harmful effect on kids. There's lots of evidence saying that masks do decrease rates of infection, along with other preventative measures, of course, but masks in and of themselves do help. Danielle Smith says, no, masks, bad for development, and they make kids sad or something. And she took it a step further, and she issued a statement on the Government of Alberta website where she said that, you know what, here's what we're going to do. If anybody tries to put masks on again, it's not going to happen. And I'm going to talk to lawyers and my new pet Shandro and see if maybe we should be appealing this decision by this judge. This just comes a couple of days after Danielle Smith said that she would absolutely respect the decisions of the courts. Here she is already saying, well, I don't like what the court did. So let's be clear. This isn't about masks. That's not what this is about. This is about the fact that in a health emergency, the Chief Medical Officer of Health is empowered to do whatever she believes is necessary to deal with that emergency. And that power is separate from the Premier's office. That scares the crap out of Danielle Smith. It's also more than likely that this is a direct challenge to Danielle Smith's whole worldview. Because her opinions on COVID are not based on science. They're not based on evidence. They're based on internet conspiracies, misinformation, and disinformation that she's continued to share herself. This isn't about science or evidence, and it's certainly not about what's best for Albertans. And on that note, there's a couple other things that we wanted to clarify, we thought might be worth clarifying. Danielle Smith has been cranking out the memes talking about the carbon tax. One of the big things that she likes to say a lot is, oh, the carbon tax is super bad, you guys. It's really, really bad. And the federal government and the Notley-Singh-Trudeau alliance, they're all they're going to jack up the carbon tax so much, and it's just not fair. It's not fair when people are having to deal with inflation and increased cost of living, and they're going to start doing it. It's in April. It's so fast. She's even gone so far as quoting herself, being quoted by the news organization, official state media of Danielle Smith and the UCP government, complete with their logo, by the way, talking about the unfairness of the carbon tax, we wanted to set the record straight about a couple of things. That Danielle Smith, as Premier of Alberta, who has the platform to do so, apparently doesn't believe she needs to do. First of all, is the carbon tax increasing 300%? Yup, but it's happening over 7 to 8 years. This is not a 300% flip of the switch increase. It's incremental, and it's happening over time. The other thing that's critically important to realize about the increase to the carbon tax is that the increase to the carbon tax also sees an increase to the carbon tax rebate. And for the vast majority of Albertans and Canadians, they get more out of that rebate than they pay in carbon tax. So an increase to the carbon tax and an increase to the rebate actually puts more money in most Albertans' pockets, particularly low income and vulnerable people. Somebody who owns a jet and 4 boats and a jet ski, yeah, they're probably going to not come out ahead on that. But for most people, they are going to come out more ahead than they were. Now, the last thing that we wanted to talk about tonight has to do with Danielle Smith's view of Rachel Notley. Because it's much like many of Danielle Smith's worldviews, it seems to have evolved a little bit. So, Danielle Smith spent the last couple of weeks and months saying all kinds of things about how terrible, we just talked about the carbon tax thing, how terrible Rachel Notley is, and we have to stop the socialist advance of Rachel Notley. Well, in 2019, Danielle Smith wrote this: Notley is, without question, the inheritor of the Lougheed tradition. That's not to say he was a full-on socialist, but Notley isn't either. I think most Albertans have been shocked to see how pragmatic she's governed, particularly as it concerns natural resources. That's a pretty high praise. And it's worth noting that this column was written at the very end of Rachel Notley's tenure as Premier of Alberta. So Rachel Notley hasn't governed since this column was written, really. There's nothing really that Rachel Notley could do that's different. So the only thing that seems to have changed is that Danielle Smith's perception of Rachel Notley, her feelings about Rachel Notley, and what she's willing to say haven't been informed, unsurprisingly, by evidence or history or record. They're being informed by political expediency. Now, on the show before, we've taken plenty of pot shots at Rachel Notley and the NDP. They've got problems. There's no getting around that. But if you're going to attack a person or an organization, it's probably best to do it based on actual facts. And if you're going to revise your position, it's probably best to revise that position based on actual facts. If you're just revising your position based on what's convenient for you at that moment, it doesn't make you principled. It makes you the opposite of it. And that's it for another episode of The Breakdown. We want to say a big thank you to everybody who has been listening to the show, supporting the show, all of that. We've got some big changes coming down the pipe that we're really excited to share. And we're maybe going a little bit national. We've got some announcements that are coming. It's going to be fun. But we also want to say a particular shout out to all of our Patreon supporters. For those of you that haven't listened to the end of the show before, we've got some wonderful folks who support us via Patreon. You can be a wonderful folk supporting us on Patreon too. All you have to do is go to www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for the price of giving up a fancy cup of coffee a month, you can help us to continue to try to produce the content that we produce here. It helps to pay for all of the technical stuff. It helps to pay for the FOIP requests that we do, unsuccessful though that they may be a large part of the time. And it makes a big difference in us just being able to produce the show. So if you have the means, we would love nothing more than if you went there and signed up. And if you don't have the means, we totally get that too. Maybe share videos, like a few videos. smash that subscribe button, as the kids say. But we want to say thank you to everybody who has been paying attention to us. We are going to continue doing it. We hope you do too. So until next week, we're going to be doing 2 shows next week for sure, because we're going to be doing our regular Sunday show, but we're also going to be doing our November 8th by-election extravaganza, which will probably go way too late in the evening. But we're going to do that. So until then, take care of yourselves. Keep the conversation going.